During the 1950s and at least halfway through the 1960s, communities in Western Virginia were totally segregated and representative of the Jim Crow South. Counties like Augusta were totally segregated. There were separate drinking fountains, separate restrooms, separate facilities in bus depots and train stations like the Chesapeake and Ohio station here in Stanton. Even though the Brown decision desegregated schools in 1954, schools in the area continued to be segregated at least until 1965. Barbershops, hotels, churches, and public parks were also racially segregated.
My name is Stuart Eugene Wilson, Jr. I used to live here on the property. My father worked here on the property as a farmhand because Montgomery Hall used to be a farm before it became a park. And my father was a farmhand here for Mr. Alexander Thomas. And then after Mr. Thomas sold the farm to the city, then my dad went to work for the city on the street department. That's how we came to be here. In other words, we were here before the park was even here. Well, we did most everything. We played croquet, we played ping pong, we played softball. It depended on who was here and what they decided to do. Play cards. They've even had, during 4th of July times, they would even have bicycle contests. You would decorate your bicycles, and it was just a recreational place.
My church would come on Thursdays once a year. There was a bus and it was owned and operated by an African American at that time. And this one day, Thursday, was set aside, and we called it the Sunday school picnic. The church would come to Montgomery Hall Park. We would board the bus with our picnic baskets, brimming over with all kinds of good things, and come to the park. And if I recall, we would be let off like at the rear entrance to Montgomery Hall Park, and we were here then to spend the entire day. I'm not sure what time we would go home. I'm thinking it was around 6 o'clock in the evening, so we spent probably from 10 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening here at Montgomery Hall Park.
When I was 17, we used to come up here in the evenings and play, because at that time they hadn't laid it out completely for all types of recreation during that time, but we always could play ball, and then we used to swim at night. Of course, I shouldn't tell this, but we boys used to go into the pool at night, and somebody say, "Here come the policeman." We grab our clothes and roll back over the fence. I remember that. Those were the days when people would come from all the areas. Roanoke, Charlottesville. It looked like Montgomery Hall Park was mostly blacks at that time would come into the area. But that's the only recreation that we actually had that was wholesome. Yeah. I mean, it was a joyful, wholesome time. Looked like when you come to Montgomery Hall Park, enjoyed evening, days, just like you didn't want to leave, because the coming together meant so much. Yeah.
I remember the nice times that I've had out at Montgomery Hall Park. We had quite a fair out here, and we wasn't bothered by nobody, and we would just made ourselves satisfied.
Stanton never had a way to name things, name parks, name buildings, name things. And so you just, names would appear. So somebody called me one day and said this building right here was going to be named for a white secretary who worked here and was ill. And I said, "What do you want me to do about it?" And they said, that's the African American park, that's the black park. And they've already named the park fields and things after white folks. Why is everything, what do we do? So I got the black community, I said, "What do you want it named?" They said, "Well, Miss Givens, she was the administrator, she ran the park. It ought to be named for her." So we got together, we got the proposal written, we got everything done, and the city almost had to go for it. They named this building, as you can see, the Irene Givens. And we got Miss Givens' name on it. And so the very next week, the city came out with an ordinance on where you have to go through to get something named for somebody. And I said, were y'all afraid I was going to try to get another building named after a black person? And we got all these guidelines now we have to go by. And so we don't really bother to name anything now because it's too much trouble. But I did get this named after Miss Givens.
Mom's Givens was an absolutely loving person. Everybody in the community loved her. She was a community person, very active woman in the community. Montgomery Hall Park was I would call the hub of the black social environment in Stanton, Virginia. It was the place where the blacks, African Americans, came to unwind. You could come to Montgomery Hall Park and be yourself. We came to Montgomery Hall Park for the Sunday school picnic once a year. And then when my cousin started dating someone that was an employee of DuPont, they had the DuPont picnic here.
Once a year, DuPont would give its black employees a picnic, and they supplied everything. They would supply sodas, ice cream, whatever, and that was a big, this ground would be full of people.
It was fun. I can remember coming, and I can remember my big thing was the dancing. I loved the dance hall out there because I loved the music, and I liked the jitterbug. I was back there where I liked to get out there and really dance.
Everybody loved the dance hall. Oh boy, those were the good old days. And there used to be a jukebox in there. And we wore that jukebox out.
Oh, the dances were very nice. I remember a lot about those because at that time there was another building that's been torn down that our VFW had our meeting room there. And the bowling alley was under it. And then we had our meeting room upstairs, and it was big enough for us to have dinners, to sell dinners and raise money for our organization, and we would just have gatherings for ourselves there in our meetings. But really the dances were really nice because we would bring in some of the local bands, and play.
We had Miss Givens down looking at it, watching everything we did. You couldn't dance close. You had to have daylight. And she'd stand there in that door and watch you. She knew when it was a slow song on, here she come. She made sure we weren't dancing close together.
That's where you met the fellows at that time. The buses would come from Covington, Luray, Lexington, Stewart's Draft, Waynesboro, all the surrounding counties to meet here at Montgomery Hall Park simply because this was the one place that the blacks could come.
I guess it was more or less a need for a place to socialize. But once the movement or the park was started, of course it was a great thing because we had a place to come and socialize, meet our friends. But it was one of those things, you would have to have known the era during that time. That was still a time when black people just weren't respected as they are now.
Well, my understanding of segregation was that we lived on one side of town and whites lived on the other side of town. And it was the only time we were able to communicate with whites was when my grandmother took me over to the neighborhood in which she cleaned the house, and I played with the owner's son. And segregation is just where, when I got through playing with him, I went home and he stayed there.
Two different societies, one white and the other black, inhabited most of the Central Valley of Virginia. Black and whites knew each other fairly well and mostly had cordial relationships with one another. Blacks depended upon white physicians, they had white employers, and oftentimes they had white friends. But these friendships were limited. Whites and blacks prayed in separate churches, they went to separate schools, and they lived in two very, very separate worlds. The idea of whites and blacks going to the same recreational park was something that could not possibly happen in this Jim Crow world of segregated Western Virginia.
The theaters, we only could go to one theater. That was the Strand Theater. The Dixie and the Visalite, we could not go. At the Strand Theater, we had to go up the stairs to the balcony. We couldn't sit down in the lower part of the auditorium. I think this is why they gave the park to us. They didn't want us into the Gypsy Hill Park to start with. One day a year, and I guess it'd be just about the end of summer, they allowed the black to go and swim in the swimming pool and the playgrounds. And after that day was over with, they drained the swimming pool. So there wasn't any more swimming for anyone in that area. I didn't think much about it at the time, but as the years passed, when I grew older, I found out why they drained the pool. Because they had the black in there swimming, and they didn't want the white to come after us to swim in the pool. I guess once they had the park built for the black, they didn't have any use to go to Gypsy Hill Park. I would rather come here and feel comfortable than to go to Gypsy Hill Park and people didn't want you there.
Because, I mean, we had our own affairs and we were enjoying them. And to get with, someone else that really, well, I guess some wanted us and some didn't. They really didn't, dawn on me that we really needed all that because we were having such a good time among ourselves.
On Saturdays, we would have buses that came in from Lynchburg and Roanoke and different places, and they would they'd come up and they'd gather in the park, and it was an all-day thing, activity. People it was just dancing, and kids played on the playground, and it was fun back in those days.
Well, I worked as a pool cashier during the summer months of 1965 and 66, and my father used to play baseball out here. He was a member of what they call the Wildcats. He played first base, I think it was. Well, my job was admitting the people to the pool. We had an admission fee from Monday through Friday. The fee for children was like 5 cents, and on weekends it was 35 cents. And we also had swimming instructors. They gave lessons for 5 cents. Montgomery Hall Park was like home to a lot of people. And there were many people coming and going using the pool. It was one of the main attractions here.
And not too long ago, they wanted to close it down, but I had to approach them and tell them that they could not do that. What you mean? They wanted to close down because it wasn't properly cared for, I guess, or something.
A couple of things I'd like to mention about the park. One is I noticed the trash cans after I was on the council. I began to notice things more. And the trash cans would have GHP on them, which let me know they were from Gypsy Hill Park. So they would bring the old trash cans over here and buy Gypsy Hill Park new trash cans. So I complained about that, and I don't know what they're doing now, but the city manager said, we'll just buy trash cans and put City of Staten and don't put any park on them. And another thing that has disturbed some African Americans about the pool, if they don't have enough lifeguards. I had a lady coming in 2 years in a row. She brought her family in here, about a couple of hundred people. And she'd write ahead and say, we want to use the pool. And I've got calls 2 years where she's gotten here and they don't have enough lifeguards, so they'll close this pool and send everybody to Gypsy Hill. Which is understandable if you don't have lifeguards, but try to tell that to a couple hundred black folks that just came in town.
Well, Gypsy Hill Park had a bear cage with real bears in it. Of course, they had tennis courts. We didn't have tennis courts that I recall at that time. And of course, the swimming pool was much larger. And then they had a big building called the Garden Center now, which is much bigger than this. But this manse has a lot more historical things to it than I think the garden center does. So if you weigh what was here versus what was there, and whether or not the people that attended enjoyed themselves as much coming to this park versus going there, I think equally we enjoyed coming. I know we enjoyed coming here to this park, because this was one thing that we could say was ours. So we are hoping to just keep improving on the things that are left that remind us of what once was and what really has gone away. You don't visually see those things, but you remember that, you know, once we had this, this, and this. Now we've moved on, and we want to hold on to the places like Montgomery Hall Park. And I'm not saying that to say that we want to hold on to it as a black park, but we want to hold on to the memories that we made while we were coming to this park. So there have been changes. There have been good, and there have been some not so good changes. So, but we accept where we are at this time.
Though I am now well past 60 years old, I can still remember those wonderful summer days to the city of Stanton, which for me was only within the boundaries of Montgomery Hall Park. Thank God I now live in a world of equal opportunities, but I do look back to those Jim Crow days and regard Stanton's all-black park with lots of nostalgia. And what an amazing place it was. A public park organized and maintained by blacks, for blacks, during the Jim Crow era.